Hi, this is Phil Greenwood again from the University of Wisconsin School of Business. And we want to do our third in a series of podcasts on craft beer finance for craft brewers, craft brewer distributors. Today, this session, we want to talk about managing liquidity, mainly the ability of a firm to manage its short-term cash flow. First thing we want to talk about, building on our previous podcast, is develop a definition for this thing called working capital requirement. Working capital requirement will provide us with a number of whether we have enough short-term capital or if we need extra short-term capital. The way we'll define it is we'll take current assets like receivables and inventory and any prepaid expenses, leave cash out of it, and subtract from it something called spontaneous current liabilities. And typically what spontaneous current liabilities mean are things like payables and accrued expenses that are not interest-bearing. So a number we'll come up with, in this case, if we come up with a positive number, we'll say that this company has short-term financing needs. In other words, there'll be current assets that aren't yet funded. Another thing we'll want to measure is something called the liquidity ratio, which will help us develop the net liquidity position. The net liquidity position is simply is going to give us a relationship of long-term financing in the company after fixed assets to our working capital requirement. It'll give us a percentage that we can track over time and that we can also compare ourselves with other competitors and industry averages. The higher the proportion of working capital required that's financed with long-term funds, typically the more liquid the firm. So if a company has a lot of long-term debt and equity that isn't absorbed by net fixed assets, there's a lot more capital available to fund the operations of the firm. To get to that ratio, we're going to calculate the liquidity ratio as net long-term financing, again, which will be equity plus long-term debt minus net fixed assets divided by the working capital requirement. Using that distributor from the previous podcast, you can see that in 2012 they had long-term financing of $106,000, equity plus long-term debt. Subtract out fixed assets or net fixed assets after depreciation. They had $50,000 left over for their working capital requirements. Working capital requirements, receivables, inventory, any other prepaid expenses, minus payables and accrued expenses of $59,000. We take one divided by the other and we develop a ratio of 84.7%. Now, is that a good or a bad ratio? We don't specifically know at this time, but what we do know is that we can track that over time. Typically, the higher the ratio, the better. The higher the percentage, the better. 2012 and 2013 in this example, the number looks pretty consistent. But as you can see in 2014, that percentage goes down. In other words, the working capital requirement is either increasing faster than our net long-term financing, or we don't have enough long-term financing, or we're losing it due to losses or whatever a situation might be. Now, when we have these ratios or numbers like working capital requirement, how else might we use them? A professor out of NYU, New York University, Damodaran, who's a finance professor, tracks a number of ratios by industries. For instance, he will track working capital requirements in relation to sales by particular industry. So you can check in this particular slide. If you go down about halfway, there's a category called alcoholic beverages, of which he has 22 firms in his sample. And in his sample, the average of these firms is working capital requirement of 22.12% divided by sales. So we could use that and comparing ourselves with that to say, are we pretty similar to the other companies, or are there major differences? Maybe we have too much working capital or not enough. Another thing Damodaran has or keeps track of is by industry, the various components of working capital. In other words, what are they in relation to sales? Again, if you go about 5 or 6 items down from the top, you can see again alcoholic beverages, the sample. In that sample, about 14 accounts receivable, what customers owe us, represent about their average about 14% of total annual sales. Inventory is about 22%. And accounts payables, they maintain about 16.56% in relation to sales. So we're starting to develop some ratios, some measurements that we see how industry players might utilize, what different industries utilize, and how we might compare to that. Because what we want to do, especially in our next couple podcasts, is discuss the balancing act that's required in managing your working capital. In other words, how much is too much working capital in the form of receivables, inventory, or payables? How do we balance that with making sure we have enough cash on hand in our operations that we can keep things growing, but yet not be too strapped for situations or not have too much cash?